We're just waiting for committee to start, so we're just going to watch the House for a few minutes until committee starts, but it should be any minute now.
The Canadian Police Association that has come on side indicating that they strongly support the legislation. And I think that says something in itself, Mr. Speaker. The other thing that I would emphasize at the beginning is to amplify the fact that, Liberals are very much concerned about individual rights. In fact, it was a Liberal government that brought in the Charter of Rights. The issue of privacy is something that we take very seriously, Mr. Speaker. But we also want to deal with the issues that Canadians have been asking us to deal with specifically during the last election. And Bill C-2 does that. Let's reverse it a little bit, where we have the Prime Minister talking about building one Canadian economy. And where that comes from, Mr. Speaker, is during the election, Canadians were concerned about Donald Trump, the tariffs, and trade. And you will recall that the criticism that was being leveled by the President of the United States towards Canada was the issue of fentanyl, of our borders not being secure. I remember back late last year talking about Canada has a strong, healthy border. And at the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives constantly criticized the border and the efforts of the government in trying to explain that we had strength within our borders. You said there was no problem. And I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, that if we take a look at it, contrast Pierre Poilievre when he sat in cabinet, and I've made reference to this in the past, Mr. Speaker, when he sat in the cabinet, and when you talk about the border, the first thing that comes to mind with anyone that has any sort of parliamentary history over the last 20 years is that Pierre Poilievre was a part of a government that cut support to Canada's border security. Hundreds of millions of dollars and hundreds of personnel.
Okay, thank God we don't have to listen to this anymore. Trans committee starting. Or TRAN. What bad? Yeah. That was a misspeak. It is the transport committee, so I guess I am still on the right path there.
Of the Standing Committee on Transport, Infrastructure and Communities. Pursuant to Standing Order of Reference of Monday, June 16th, 2025, the committee is resuming its consideration of Bill C-5, an act to enact the Free Trade and Labour Mobility in Canada Act and the Building Canada Act. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the standing orders. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. Before we begin, I want to ask all in-person participants to consult the guidelines written on the cards on the table. These measures are in place to help prevent audio and feedback incidents and to protect the health and safety of all participants, including our interpreters. You will also notice a QR code on the card which links to a short awareness video. Colleagues, I would now like to welcome our witnesses for the next 2 hours. Appearing before us today, we have the Honourable Chrystia Freeland, Minister of Transport and Internal Trade. Welcome to you, Minister. We have the Honourable Dominic LeBlanc, Minister responsible for Canada-US Trade, Intergovernmental Affairs and One Canadian Economy. Welcome to you, sir. And the Honourable Rebecca Alty, Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations. Welcome to you. Also, from Clean Growth Office of the Privy Council, we have Sarah Jackson, Director, and Daniel Morin, Senior Advisor. From the Privy Council Office, we have Christian Fox, Deputy Clerk of the Privy Council and Deputy Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs, and Janine R. C'est Janine? Excuse-moi, je viens de Québec en plus.
I come from Quebec. Perfect. So, Janine Marichotte.
Governmental Affairs, and from the Department of Crown Indigenous Relations, Valerie Gideon, Deputy Minister, and Bruno Steinke, Senior Director. Welcome to you all.
And we have Arun Bangaraj, the Deputy Minister of Transport, here with us too.
We could not have a meeting without mentioning his presence in the back. So welcome to you, sir. So, ministers, we'll begin with 5-minute opening remarks. And with that, Minister Freeland, I'd love to turn the floor over to you.
Point of order.
5 minutes, please. Yes, Ms. Kazan.
Before the testimony begins, I was wondering if I could receive unanimous consent to have a round of questions at the end of the rounds.
Similar to what we did yesterday,
Yes.
Ms. Kazan. Is there any opposition to providing Ms. Kazan with 5 minutes to pose questions to the witnesses? No. Seeing none, adopted unanimously. I'll make sure you get that time, Ms. Kazan. Minister Freeland, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes, please.
Okay, merci, Monsieur le Président. Canada. U.S. tariffs are battering our country and are threatening to push the world economy into a recession. Hard-working Canadians are losing their jobs, businesses are losing their customers, and investors are holding back. That is why it is so essential for us to press ahead with a project that costs nothing and can be accomplished at the stroke of a pen, delivering free trade in Canada. Parce que, en bout de ligne, la décision de bâtir une économie canadienne unique.
The decision to build a one Canada economy is a decision to trust us and trust us all. We have decided that the delicious steak in Calgary is no doubt also deemed delicious in Charlottetown, and that a Moncton dentist could be trusted as a dentist or a hygienist in Quebec as well.
Study published by the IMF, the impact of these barriers to internal trade is the equivalent to Canadians imposing a 7% tariff on ourselves. A 2016 report by Trevor Toome and Lucas Albrecht in the Canadian Journal of Economics found that removing all barriers to internal trade and labour mobility could lower prices by up to 15%. A 2016 study by the Senate Committee on Banking, Trade and Commerce found that lifting barriers to internal trade could boost productivity by up to 7%. And research by Trevor Toome and Ryan Minucha, published by the Macdonald-Laurier Institute in 2024, estimates that free trade in Canada would add up to $200 billion to our economy. Alors, saisissons cette occasion.
Taking this opportunity to transform Canada by trusting ourselves, and let us move forward with one Canada economy. And that is the reason for which we have tabled this bill. We want to eliminate domestic trade barriers to build one Canada economy.
PEI, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Ontario, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba have all passed legislation to remove barriers to internal trade. BC has passed its historic Economic Stabilization Act. Quebec is advancing its own reforms. I do want to salute Jason Kenney, who has been a leader in this area as when he was Premier of Alberta. Memorandum of Understanding between Ontario and other provinces, as well as powerful regional agreements like the New West Partnership, signal new levels of cooperation. I want to be clear. The federal legislation is about being part of a broader wave, a broader national effort to remove barriers to internal trade and labor mobility. This legislation by itself won't do the job, and there will be more work to do after, I hope, we pass this legislation on Friday. But this is the federal government's contribution to the excellent work provinces and territories are doing. It's important that we, federal MPs, do our share. And what a delicious irony it will be for us all to respond to tariffs imposed from abroad by finally tearing down the tariff and trade barriers we Canadians have imposed on each other. Let's get this done once and for all and deliver free trade in Canada. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister Freeland. Next, we'll turn the floor over to Minister LeBlanc. Minister LeBlanc, you have 5 minutes, please.
Mr. Chair, Monsieur le Président, à travers vous, aux collègues.
Through you to our colleagues, thank you for having invited me to speak to you all today. I'm here with my colleagues to talk about this bill that will allow national interest projects to move forward. Currently, Canada is weathering a storm of change, but we're also facing a pivotal moment in our history. Custom tariffs from the States, an increase in protectionism, these two elements threaten jobs and businesses in Canada. Global markets have rarely been so volatile. Due to this new reality, Canadians expect that their government act, that they be bold, that they be determined, and that they be in solidarity with each other.
Canada needs to be able to build strategic infrastructure, transportation corridors, energy networks that are essential for Canadians' prosperity and economic security. We must be able to move our resources from coast to coast to coast and get them to the world more quickly and more reliably. This is an opportunity for the federal government to work with provinces and territories and with Indigenous partners to identify and accelerate the projects we need right now to assure our autonomy, our security, and our trade diversification. The One Canadian Economy Act aims to do just that. It's a key tool to secure Canadian jobs for this generation and for generations to come, as all of us would hope. At the recent First Ministers meeting in Saskatoon, where Chrystia and I and our colleague, the Minister of Energy and Natural Resources, were present, premiers from every political stripe expressed their enthusiastic support for advancing nation-building projects, because premiers understood that in order for Canada to succeed, we must build one Canadian economy out of 13 and thereby build a shared future. Trop souvent, il a fallu du temps.
Too often, too much time has gone by before decisions were made for projects that could have connected our country and built our economy. This bill is our opportunity to do things differently, whilst respecting our values and our responsibilities as a country.
The approval of projects, while obviously, Mr. Chair, continuing to abide by constitutionally mandated responsibilities towards Indigenous peoples and ensuring the protection and the environmental assessments that impose as well. To that end, the government will set up a new major projects office that will provide a seamless single point of contact for project proponents once they're designated, and for stakeholders, provinces, and Indigenous partners as well. My colleague will expand on many of these aspects. The One Canadian Economy Act is about nation building on a scale not seen for generations. It's about transitioning from should we build to how do we build. The Prime Minister and our government have been clear about our objectives. We hope these objectives, Mr. Chair, are shared by members of this committee and members in the other House. Canadians have entrusted us to do things differently and better and to move nation-building projects forward. And we believe this legislation is an important step in that direction. And after you hear the phenomenal comments from my colleague to my right, we look forward, as you can't imagine, to your questions, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Minister LeBlanc. Pleasure as always to have you here. Next, we'll turn the floor over to Minister Alty. The floor is yours. You have 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to begin by acknowledging that we are gathered on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. I'm pleased to be here today in support of the One Economy Act, legislation that reflects our government's commitment. I'm pleased to be here today in support consultation and accommodation with Indigenous rights holders.
Okay, I'm going to have to refresh this. Give me a sec.
An economy that works for all Canadians, including First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people.
It does it again.
Minister LeBlanc and Minister Freeland have outlined the substance of the bill, and I'll focus on how we'll be implementing this with Indigenous peoples. First, let me start by being crystal clear. Major projects will only proceed under this Act with meaningful consultation and accommodation with Indigenous rights holders, whose Section 35 rights may be affected. Cette loi exige une consultation significative avec les
This needs strong consultations with Indigenous peoples through the designation process, and after that, when it comes to elaborating the conditions that will be applicable to these projects.
Not optional. It's protected under the Canadian Constitution and embedded throughout the legislation. Thanks to the efforts of Indigenous leaders, governments, and representative organizations, last year we also passed an amendment to the Interpretation Act, which ensures that all legislation, including new legislation like the One Economy Act, is interpreted in a way that upholds and does not diminish the Aboriginal and treaty rights recognized and affirmed in Section 35 of the Constitution. We also have legal obligations under the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, as well as our modern treaties and self-government agreements, to ensure that the duty to consult and accommodate is honored and honored in full. As we undertake this nation-building effort, the principle of free, prior, and informed consent must and will guide every project. As mentioned, this legislation mandates that there must be meaningful consultation and accommodation with Indigenous peoples during both the process of determining which projects are in national interest and the development of the rigorous conditions for each project. In determining which projects proposed by Indigenous peoples, provinces, and territories are in the national interests, we'll be evaluating based on whether they A. strengthen Canada's autonomy, resilience, and security, B. provide economic or other benefits to Canadians, C. have a high likelihood of successful execution, D. advance the interests of Indigenous peoples, and E. contribute to clean growth and to meeting Canada's objectives with respect to climate change. The legislation is incentivizing early engagement with Indigenous peoples. Proponents who don't engage with Indigenous peoples before bringing their projects forward for consideration under this legislation will be given a lower evaluation. The intent of the legislation is to streamline the approvals to advance major projects. We know that failing to uphold our legal responsibilities around consultation and accommodation will only lead to costly and time-consuming delays in the courts. This legislation is about supporting projects that are not only shovel-ready, but shovel-worthy. Projects that respect Indigenous knowledge and uphold Aboriginal and treaty rights. We'll be looking for projects that have Indigenous support and, even better, Indigenous equity in the project. Pour bien faire les choses, le nouveau processus.
To do things well, this new process in this historic bill provides for the creation of a new major projects office at the federal level that would unite all federal departments so that there could be one series of conditions for projects to be able to be approved. At the heart of this new office will be an advisory committee for Indigenous peoples.
Indigenous participation in this new process from start to finish. At the same time, being a reliable partner to Indigenous peoples is not just about upholding the duty to consult and accommodate. Enabling the creation of long-term wealth and prosperity for Indigenous peoples through equity ownership is central to building Canada strong. That's why we doubled the Indigenous Loan Guarantee Program from $5 billion to $10 billion, enabling more Indigenous communities to become owners of major projects. Just this year, 36 First Nations in British Columbia used this program to secure a 12.5% equity share in a major pipeline project, generating long-term income and economic power for their communities.
Chair, I think she's over time.
En vérité, notre économie ne peut être forte.
The truth is that our economy can only be strong if it benefits and is profitable for everyone. We need to invest in our economy, and we need to invest in Indigenous communities. That will be good for the whole country.
Of building Canada's future economy, one that includes and is built with Indigenous people. Merci beaucoup. Masicho. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ministers, for your opening remarks. We'll begin our line of questioning today with Mr. Lawrence. Mr. Lawrence, the floor is yours. You have 6 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the ministers for agreeing to be here for the next 6 hours. We appreciate that. No? A little fun to begin with here, guys. You can smile here. So Conservatives agree directionally that, of course, we need national projects built. We need the elimination of interprovincial trade barriers. In fact, over the last 10 years, the old Liberal government was very much against that, we felt. We are glad that the new government appears at least open and directionally. But we do have some concerns, particularly on the ethics, accountability, and transparency side. And I'll start by referencing sections 21, 22, and 23 of the Building Canada Act. when these sections are combined together, what they have the ability to do is give a minister the ability to exempt any national project from any piece of legislation passed since 1867, with the exception of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Given that, and given the fact that the Prime Minister worked for one of the largest constructions and manufacturers of national projects, of infrastructure in Canada and perhaps in the world, in Brookfield, could you please identify to us the screens that will be put in place to make sure that we don't have conflicts of interest or other lobbying concerns?
Well, Mr. Chair, perhaps I could, and thank you for the question, Mr. Lawrence. It's a good question. And you're right when you identified the operation of those particular sections. In no discussions that I was in or that I participated in was exempting requirements under the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Act, for example, would be a piece of legislation that obviously you're referring to. As the minister who would be designated as responsible for this act, I can't imagine that in the course of my recommendation to Cabinet, that would be the kind of exemption that we're looking at. But I'm obviously would, in any circumstance, be governed by the advice that we would get from officials from the Privy Council office and the ethics commissioner in those circumstances. I get the hypothetical question you're asking, and I've seen you and your colleagues raise these concerns in different fora elsewhere. I just think it feels very hypothetical that we would be approving a national project and look to exempt responsibilities of any member of parliament or public office holder, member of cabinet from the ethics obligations. I wouldn't ever do that myself. I wouldn't go to cabinet with that kind of recommendation, but I take your point.
Thank you, Minister. Well, I would follow the old Ronald Reagan quote of the "I trust but verify," and it is striking that the way that 21, 22, and 23 work together in the Building Canada is literally any legislation can be exempt, including the Conflict of Interest Act, the Lobbying Act, the Income Tax Act, the Criminal Code. And while I certainly want to trust, I would also like to verify. So my question would you be open to an amendment that would restrict that to prevent exemption from the Conflict of Interest Act and other acts?
Again, Mr. Lawrence, thank you for the question. And the Deputy Clerk, because as I say, it is a good question, and I wouldn't want to leave an impression that is inaccurate. And perhaps Chris Fox could add something if, in my explanation, it's not as precise as it should be. There are limits in terms of what acts or what exemptions could be issued. In Part 1, it talks about Acts of Parliament, Fisheries Act, Indian Act, International River Improvements Act, National Capital Act, Navigable Waters Protection Act, Migratory Birds Convention Act. It doesn't speak of some of the ethics obligations, the criminal code.
If I could just...
It speaks, but, and again, because your question is a good one, I don't... Yeah. Again, I've hypothetical question, we're going to approve or designate a project and exempt it from the Criminal Code of Canada. Doesn't feel like I just don't want. Doesn't seem like a legitimate line of questioning.
No, and I appreciate that, but the Act actually says in 21 you can add other acts to it, which means you could, in theory, add the criminal code. I'm not saying you would, Minister. I'm saying that the possibility there too exists, and we have seen in the old Liberal government that we've seen some ethical lapses, and so I know, shocking, and so we would be looking for an amendment to make sure, and specifically, like I said, the Prime Minister, of course, worked for one of the largest infrastructure, or ran one of the largest infrastructure companies in the world, and so putting those screens in place, I think, are incredibly important. Would you have any details on how the Prime Minister screens might be put in place to make sure we don't have conflicts of interest?
The Prime Minister has answered the questions, and the Ethics Commissioner's office is able to talk about all the screens that are appropriately in place to ensure that there is, in fact, no conflict of interest or appearance thereof. I'm not sure that any of us are going to speak to those specific ethics provisions, but perhaps Sarah, can you add something?
Yes, just on the controls that are in place with relation to 21-22. So yes, on the recommendation of the designated minister, the GIC could add acts and regulations. That needs to be done with respect to the purpose of the Act, which is to advance national interest projects, provide environmental protection, respect Indigenous rights. So it needs to be in keeping with the purpose of the Act, first of all. And then the regulations under Section 22 would need to actually be on the recommendation of the minister responsible for each of those acts. So the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans, if modifications were being made to the application of the Fisheries Act. So that's another control that's in place.
Thank you.
They're also subject to Statutory Instruments Act regulatory process.
Thank you very much, Ms. Jackson, and thank you, Mr. Lawrence. Next line of questioning will come from MP Nguyen. The floor is yours. You have
just
6 minutes,
destroyed
please.
my ears eating
Thanks very
his
much.
mic.
Thank you to our colleagues for joining us today. I wanted to ask a question to Minister Freeland. We know that this is clearly a time when we need to be building for Canada, and that that is what this bill is trying to achieve in terms of our objectives, in terms of strengthening trade corridors and accelerating those nation-building projects. Can you speak to how these could improve our transportation infrastructure and investments? In my riding of Spadina Harbourfront, we've got Union Station and Toronto Island Airport. I'd love to hear more details about how this may open up opportunities for our country as we do that building.
Well, thank you very much for the question, and congratulations on your election and on joining us here in this House and in this committee. It's really great. We are neighbors geographically as MPs. I actually want to start by picking up on something that Mr. Lawrence said about the longstanding Conservative support of some of these measures. And I do want to specifically single out Mr. Albus for having, in all seriousness, for having championed this issue at a time when it wasn't so much in vogue. We all remember his spirited Free the Beer campaign, and he was absolutely right. I think it's very exciting. We all know as politicians that there can be really good ideas, but you need the political moment sometimes to make them happen. That, I think, was the case with creating a national system of early learning and childcare. For 50 years, Canadian women had been fighting for it. Policy experts all agreed it was a good thing and would make our economy more productive, would make life more affordable for families, would give women more choice. But it took a particular moment to make it happen. I believe that today, when it comes to internal trade and major nation-building projects, that moment is now. But I really do want to put on the record that Mr. Albus has been championing this for a long time, and that's great. Thank you. To your specific questions, there are 2 ways that this bill will help the life of every single person each one of us represents. One is the internal trade element, and truly getting rid of barriers to internal trade, getting rid of barriers to labor mobility. It's going to make our life easier. It will make it easier for each one of our constituents to move around the country and work around the country. It will make it easier for each one of our constituents who has a business to sell things from that business or provide services across the country. It will give all of us more choice. I think it's going to have a nation-building impact also that is psychological, because we will, as we build economic networks that are truly pan-Canadian, we will truly be acting as Canadians when we do business or when we perform services, rather than as residents of a province. The second element Chi, that you mentioned is equally important. I think every single one of us as an MP has a list of projects that we really want to get built in our riding. Every single one of us has spoken with frustrated constituents who ask us, why can't we get this project built faster? This legislation is an opportunity to build those projects. Now, I'm here as Minister for Internal Trade, but I am also Transport Minister, and I'm glad you mentioned Island Airport. I think it provides a lot of benefit for our city and the city you and I both represent and our country. This is an opportunity to support our airports, to support our trade corridors across the country. And I do really hope that every single MP who's a member of this committee will be actively working with proponents, working with premiers, working with Indigenous people in your communities to put forward great nation-building projects that could be facilitated by this legislation.
Thanks very much. So I have another question. I know we have in the preamble and in the language of the legislation, we point to both Section 35 and UNDRIP. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm hoping that you can help me understand how these sit with the legislation and, you know, is there one that's more powerful? If you could help me understand as a layperson, that would be really great. Either Minister Alty or Minister LeBlanc, please.
Thank you. Yes, the Constitution ultimately. And so there's a number of not only clauses in this legislation, but there's pieces of legislation out. So, for example, the Constitution. The other one I mentioned is the Interpretation Act. That's Bill S13, which is about all legislation has to be interpreted in a way that upholds and does not diminish Aboriginal and treaty rights recognized and affirmed in Section 35. In the Act itself, I would touch on not only in the preamble, but also in the body of the legislation. It requires the government to consult with Section 35 rights holders in the selection of projects, as well as the process of approving, as well as the process of actually removing a project if it's deemed necessary. So that's Section 5.7, Section 7.2, Section 8.3. Again, we're also committed to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. And outside of the legislation, there's a number of things that we're looking to do, setting up a major projects office with an Indigenous Advisory Council, having funding for capacity so that Indigenous governments can meaningfully participate from start to finish, as well as the Indigenous Loan Guarantee Program. We want to see projects that are advancing Indigenous interests. Thank you
very much, Minister. Prochainement, nous avons Monsieur Barsalou-Duval. À vous la parole.
Next, Mr. Barsalou-Duval for 6 minutes. Thank you, Chair. I thank the ministers for joining us today. This bill is incredibly important. I think it's really a shame that we don't have the opportunity to properly, thoroughly study the bill. There are countless people who would have liked to testify today, but who will not be able to. And we will not give this bill the fulsome study that it warrants. The government is acting with a sense of urgency, I believe. Otherwise, the government wouldn't be proceeding quite so quickly. First question, is this not a disguised version of the Emergency Measures Act? That's what a constitutionalist wondered yesterday, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and through you, I thank the Bloc Québécois member for his question. I don't share that interpretation of the situation. The Emergency Act is only applied when there are specific legal conditions met. I participated in deciding to invoke the Emergency Act the last time, and I'm proud of the decision we made. It was the right one. It all depends on the context. Now, during the campaign, this was discussed, and we also discussed it in Kananaskis. Thank you very much, Minister. Yes, but I was going to describe the situation of emergency or urgence. You said that this is not akin to the Emergency Measures Act. Next question, then. there's a sunset clause that says that in 5 years we will no longer be able to apply it. So you're granting that power and you're allowing people to flout basically any existing legislation. So if things are not urgent, then why are we granting such extraordinary powers? Answer, you interrupted me when I was trying to explain why this is urgent. This is urgent from an economic standpoint. There is a great deal of threat from the United States. During the campaign, we often discussed how important it is to build nation-building projects which are deemed to be in the national interest. We discussed that with provincial and territorial premiers at our recent meeting in Saskatoon. We need to move to take action to diversify international trade. We also need to expand clean energy, and the government of Quebec, that's the context. That's why it's urgent. Question, but are you not taking this notion of urgent or emergency situation a bit too far? This is being seen in other countries. People are going too far. We don't want the Emergency Measures Act to be invoked left, right, and center. We don't want that to be the new trend. Is that what you're doing? Answer, no, that's not what we're doing. We cannot compare this legislation to a White House presidential order. That's an inaccurate comparison. You can see things however you see fit, but I disagree. Question. Now, you are granting people the authority to approve projects based on consultations. They might be phony or sham consultations. There won't be any criteria for you to use to approve projects because the criteria will just be suggestions. They won't be mandatory. And you will be the ones to choose the conditions that projects will be submitted to. Answer. I won't correct you necessarily, but you said there are no criteria for the selection of national interest projects. Well, my colleague did enumerate the SANC criteria contained in the bill. As my colleague explained, we might some say that we might hypothetically be able to sidestep any and every existing law. That is inaccurate. If the bill passes, this will be a process. It will go through the Governor and Council. You are exaggerating. You're really exaggerating. Question. But you will not be bound to respect sections 5 and 6 of the bill. Next, the Prime Minister, your party leader, promised that there would not be any projects without Quebec's explicit agreement. Your party leader promised us that during the election campaign, yet we don't see any trace of that in the bill. Do you intend to uphold that promise? Answer. I stood beside the Prime Minister at a press conference. The press conference when he said that we won't impose projects on provinces. But that's not in the bill. Would you state this explicitly, this promise, this commitment in the bill? Answer. I'm not a member of this committee. I'm happy to be here with you for 2 hours, not 6 hours, but I won't be here for clause by clause. Yes, but this is your government's legislation. This is really just crying wolf. You're saying, well, things are very urgent and we're going to act in your best interest, but we don't know that you will act in our best interest. You don't often participate in federal, provincial, territorial meetings, but I was there in Saskatoon meeting with the 13 provincial and territorial premiers who were elected to represent their jurisdictions. They all decided that we needed to move in this direction. You are describing some hypothetical case which could maybe happen. Yes, hypothetical though. Hypothetical. That means it could happen by government order. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
You have 5 minutes, please.
Thanks, Chair. Appreciate it. Thanks you, ministers, for being here. And just to follow up, to conclude on what my colleague Phil Lawrence was asking, so just is it safe to say that neither of the three ministers here responsible for the bill, and no accusation towards you in general, but neither of you are aware of or have seen or know about a concrete ethical screen in place for the Prime Minister? Okay, I'll just take that as a no. So let's.
These things are properly done by the Ethics Commissioner and the Deputy Clerk.
For the bill.
Ms. Fox, did you want to respond to that?
I just wanted to state quite clearly that at the Privy Council office, we are working very closely with the Prime Minister's office to manage all of the conflicts that he's declared, and that is operationalized within the communications between the Privy Council office and the Prime Minister's office, and that would be linked to anything, including this bill.
Thank you. So you may be aware, but that it is clear then that the ministers responsible aren't, but so Canadians will trust you on that. So given that this whole concept, this whole bill started in the election campaign with meetings with the premiers and the territorial leaders, there's been weeks since those meetings, weeks since parliaments have started. Is it possible, since there seems to be mixed messages about politicians sending listen and not, is it possible for either of the ministers to identify a single energy project, for example, that will be approved and ready for shovels in the ground in June 2027 if this law passes by this week?
So, Mr. Chair, through you, Ms. Tubbs, very good question. Obviously, we don't want to prejudge whether Parliament will adopt this legislation. We're hopeful. And then we're also hopeful based on, I sat Monday night and had dinner at a table with the Premier of Alberta and had a long conversation with the Premier of Saskatchewan. They are very enthusiastic about putting quickly before the Government of Canada projects that, in their view, and probably in our view, would meet the national interest test. So I think we're going to be very fortunate by the volume of projects that will come together quickly. But, and I think this is instructive, this isn't a federal infrastructure program as much as it's a way to expedite projects that provinces and territories, Indigenous partners, private sector proponents will want us to work on in an expedited, effective way that encourages investment decisions. So I think we'll have well more than one within the first 2 years, but you can imagine, I don't want to prejudge what will be submitted.
Yes, and certainly we Conservatives will join you in your hopes and prayers, but obviously would have hoped for something a little more concrete. Because, of course, as you know, and I might suggest this is a first place for you all to stop, there are dozens of projects with real proponents spending real money, losing real time, stuck in the federal regulatory process, stuck in front of all of these various pieces of legislation and regulations that now you yourselves are identifying are barriers to getting built. That's why you're bringing in C-5 to fast track these projects. I just would suggest maybe you want to start there with the real proponents of real projects stuck in front of your regulatory mess right now and give them some certainty. But to that end, can I ask you, how is it that the lack of the 2-year timeline embedded right in the legislation, including criteria and conditions that will be made behind closed doors and then where projects will be adjudicated on an ad hoc case-by-case basis, how do those two embedded uncertainty, not yet addressed in the bill, but we hope you'll accept some amendments in that regard, possibly give private sector investors or proponents that want to get these big major nation building projects to the benefit of all of us built? How does that lack of certainty in this bill give them certainty?
If I may, Ms. Stubbs, I want to start where Mr. Lawrence began. That a lot of us here are in violent agreement about the objective and that we do need to get big things built faster in Canada.
Certainly, and because you yourself announced that in 2022, and of course now.
And what I would just say is that there is a contradiction between the notion that specific projects should be named right now and the path we need to take to actually get things done. This legislation, quite intentionally, is about setting a framework which is clear, which is transparent, which gives transparency to provinces, to Indigenous organizations, to business leaders. And we need to sort of go step by step. We need to have the framework, have the transparency, hopefully get the legislation passed. As my colleague has said, there are a lot of projects waiting for this. We were together in Saskatoon, we heard from the premiers, they are very, very keen, but it would be inappropriate to actually specify the projects in the legislation. The right way to do it is create a framework, be having the conversations, and then let me tell you, as soon as this is passed, we're going to be moving with alacrity.
So what would you have to say to all the projects who will not be fast-tracked or make the cut?
Sorry, Ms. Stubbs. We'll move on now to Mr. Kellaway. Mr. Kellaway, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the ministers for being here and your testimony.
Okay, I'll be right back, 5 minutes.
I'm going to try to get questions to the three of you, so I have limited time. I'm going to start with Minister Freeland. I think you did a really good job of explaining the why this legislation in terms of eliminating federal internal trade barriers. And you talked about the what. It's impressive in terms of the potential. We could reduce costs by 15%, increase productivity by 7%, and GDP by 4%. But I think it's really important for Canadians to kind of, have a mental image of what that truly means. So hypothetically, there's a company in Cape Breton. It sells beer, really good beer. How would that impact them going forward in terms of the elimination of federal trade barriers?
So thank you very much, Mr. Kellaway, Mike, and thank you for agreeing to serve as my parliamentary secretary. It's great to be working together. As Mr. Albus identified presciently, the beer examples have a way of seizing the imagination of Canadians, so it's a good one. And what this legislation alone is not going to remove barriers to interprovincial trade, and it is not alone going to create free labor mobility. Most of the barriers are at a provincial level, and our government respects the jurisdiction of the provinces. What we have seen is, as part of this wave of patriotism across Canada, provinces stepping up. Your own province of Nova Scotia really is a leader, if not the leader, of this effort with the mutual recognition legislation. But when we talk to the provinces and territories, we know that in order to really be facilitating and encouraging true free trade in goods and services and true labor mobility, the federal government has to do its part. This legislation is about that. It's about removing the federal barriers that exist to trade in goods between provinces and territories and the federal barriers that exist to labor mobility. But I made a point in my opening remarks to be clear that the federal government is not the jurisdiction principally responsible. So this legislation is not going to do it on its own when it comes to free internal trade and movement and labor mobility. But it's a big part of it. And I hope everyone here will help us keep up the momentum after, I hope, the legislation is passed on Friday. There's a meeting, as you know very well, on July 8th of the Committee on Internal Trade of the provinces and territories to keep going. On July 15th and 16th, the Deputy Minister of Transport is hosting a hackathon of transport officials to finally get movement on trucking. So there is a lot of work still to do, but this is an important step.
Thank you, Minister Freeland. Minister Alty, does this act supersede Section 35 of the Constitution and or UNDRIP?
No, it doesn't. And if I can just take a moment to elaborate, because I do think there's talk of accelerate and there's talk of fast tracking, and so folks think that that'll impact the consultation. And one of the things I'd point to is over the last year, the department has held Crown Indigenous Relations engagement sessions with Indigenous peoples across Canada through our existing forums and tables. And it was about a proposed Crown consultation coordination. And these sessions, the concerns we heard is consultation is there's insufficient coordination. It's difficulty navigating the system. It's growing consultation fatigue where people are having that overlap duplicative process. And so with this bill, what we're really looking to do as well is having that major projects office. And without a new coordinated mechanism to navigate these problems, we are running into those issues of consultation inadequacy, into delays on projects. And so being able to streamline the process means, in one hand, I think of my territory, and if one impacted Indigenous rights holder is left out of the consultation, we've got to go back and redo it all. And so being able to have this one organization in the federal government, being able to organize it, will produce those better results. So it's not impacting the quality, but it is impacting the time.
Thank you. Thank you, Minister Alty, and thank you, Mr. Kellaway. Prochainement, nous avons Mr. Barcelou-Duval. À vous la parole.
Mr. Barcelou-Duval, 2.5 minutes, if you please. Thank you, Chair. I will continue with Monsieur LeBlanc. When we have small bills at the provincial and municipal level, these bills have to respect current statutes. Sometimes they don't necessarily require consultations, but here we're going to have big projects that will have big impacts that will often require society-level discussions because it will engage generations. And this would be subject to fewer acts than small projects that are being done by SMEs. So what we have at the end of the day is a series of decisions that will be made behind closed doors where there will be a politicization of decisions, and nothing guarantees that you won't transform yourself into the Minister of Cronyism. The Association of New Brunswick Acadians contacted us to say that they were worried because the Act would allow to ignore all other acts like the Official Languages Act. They could not have to take into account the Labour Code for these projects. So to me, that's a problem. You already have all the powers to ignore environmental projects through the projects that will be submitted. Why do you want even more powers that you don't need for these projects to move forwards? Through you, Mr. Chair, Mr. Barcelou-Duval has asked about 10 questions in one, so I'm going to do my best. First of all, I would like to encourage you to not continue under the idea that we can exempt a project from the Criminal Code or the Official Languages Act. Privy Council experts have told us, and there will be no doubt legal experts appearing here, the decision must be made pursuant to statutes and pursuant to conditions in C-5. So if we want an entrepreneur who doesn't want French or any French signage, it'll be the objectives of the bill that will be targeted. If someone doesn't want to pay bills, they could be targeted. If they don't want to pay a tax bill, they could be targeted. It's so broad that you could almost do anything. What acts, not in the 7 regulations, 13 acts in Schedule 1, will also be exempted from projects? Why not say it now? By talking about anything, you sound distracted because you're using completely ridiculous examples to try and make a point that makes no sense. You also mentioned that these projects these national interest projects will be subjected to less oversight. Please allow the Minister to answer, and then we'll move on to our next questioner. The Minister says that what I say is ridiculous, but if I look at the document, it exempts projects from any act. Any act. I'd like to ask the Minister to answer. We can move on to someone else. It would be better.
Mr. Albus, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, ministers, for your service to the country and for being here. Hopefully we'll get some accountability. Minister Freeland, there was some reference to freeing the beer, going between provinces. Really, under this act, there is nothing because if a province like BC and Alberta come up with a bilateral between the two, all it does is, this bill says that you'll just acknowledge it, recognize it, but it doesn't add any value. Is that the case?
I was very careful, Mr. Albus, in my comments, not to overstate the specific contribution this legislation will make to internal trade and labor mobility. As you know very well, the federal government's role in that space is limited. What this is about doing is the federal government doing everything appropriately within our power to contribute to the larger goal of free movement of goods, services, and people across the country. And we need to do this because it's very hard for the federal government to play the appropriate role of convener of provinces and territories if we're not doing our part.
Interprovincial shipping is actually a federal power, Minister. The Canada Post Act, for example, I had a bill C-260 that would actually give Canada Post the authorization to send beer, wine, and spirits. Right now, that can be prohibited by an individual province. That is a federal power. Moving on, it's in the Act here, it also says that you will recognize a designation or a credential from a provincial. At the technical briefing, the bureaucrats that were there, good people, mentioned that surveying, land surveyor, for example, might be. Are there any other jobs that this would apply to, or is this just so niche that it really doesn't do very much?
I've been very clear not to overstate the extent to which the federal government is our problem when it comes to barriers to interprovincial trade, movement of goods, services, and people. The fact is, this is principally a provincial matter. This law is about the federal government doing our part. There are a few specific areas that this legislation removes unilaterally, because what we're saying to the provinces and territories is this is a national effort. And I made a point in my remarks to highlight the excellent work that is being done by provinces and territories right now, because they are leading the charge. We need to salute their work. We as federal MPs collectively have a responsibility to support what they're doing, for the federal government to do our part. And I also want to be very clear. This legislation is very important when it comes to internal trade and labor mobility. It is not the end of the process, and we all have a responsibility to keep going, to support the provinces, to have truly free internal trade.
A previous Liberal Prime Minister used to say the dangers about being the head waiters to the provinces, and it seems that that's all you guys want to talk about is provinces, territories, but national interest, by its definition, has to reign over provincial interest. So, for example, the Prime Minister has said publicly that that premiers have a veto, like David Eby has said he will not support a pipeline to the Pacific, even though it would be in our national interest to get our energy to other markets. Minister, is there a national interest here, or are you only serving up for the provinces?
I am so happy that right now this is a moment of a degree of national unity and consensus around this effort of a kind I have never seen before. That meeting in Saskatoon, a province, as we know, which has a conservative government, was a meeting with more unity around free interprovincial trade and getting major projects built than any meeting of provinces, territories, and the federal government I have been present at. And so, Mr. Albus, I see no benefit and a great deal of harm at this moment when the provinces are all stepping up in the federal government somehow saying, we're going to push you guys around. The fact is, we don't need to. The provinces are doing a great job.
This is why we have a prime minister and a federal cabinet, is to decide what the national interest is. That actually is your job. But besides that, I would just go back. I'd like just to go to Minister LeBlanc.
Our job in the national interest, in fact, is to work collaboratively with provinces and territories where we can. It's
either a crisis or it's not, Minister. It's either an emergency or it's not.
Honey can be better than vinegar sometimes in building consensus.
I would like to see a list.
And right now, that's what's happening.
I would like to see a list,
I believe even the Conservatives are voting for this legislation.
Coming from my federal government.
And I'm happy about that, too.
Thank you very much, Mr. Albus, and thank you, Minister. Prochainement, nous avons Monsieur Lauzon. Monsieur Lauzon, la parole est à vous. Vous avez 5 minutes.
Mr. Lauzon, you have 5 minutes. Thank you very much. Chair, thank you to all the witnesses today for Bill C-5, which is very important. My first question has to do with the Major Projects Office. Minister Alty mentioned a certain element of this office that would be the consultation of the population so that work is done well. Could you give us some other examples of how the Major Projects Office could be useful in the context of working on major projects, and what will its role be exactly? It could be Monsieur LeBlanc, Madame Freeland as well.
Vous, Monsieur le Président.
Through you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Stéphane, for the question. And yes, you're right. The idea of having within the Privy Council this office, the idea is to receive ideas of projects that will then be put forward as ones of national interest. Now, the reason for this is to avoid the following. It is to make sure that whoever puts forward these projects, be they public, private, indigenous, provincial, municipal, don't have to go through an evaluation and approvals process that could take 5, 6, or 7 years. We want there to be an almost concierge service where we can directly assist and help the project be sent to the right minister, the right department, so that we can carry out these evaluations all at the same time. So it's not just one department that then sends it off to someone else who then sends it off to another. All this so that we can work with those who will put forward projects, who will receive the designation, so that in at least, so that in under 2 years we can approve projects. And so the idea is to be more coherent, more efficient and effective, to avoid what has become a disincentive over the years, disincentives for investors or provinces or territories. But the idea isn't to create an extra layer of bureaucracy. We'll have a small group of experts, infrastructure in the Arctic experts, scientists, experts in supply chains, and the way to have the involvement of Indigenous people so they can benefit economically. The idea is to have a committee of experts in the Privy Council. We will have the opportunity to have extra resources if need be, but the idea is to be effective, efficient, and coherent. So instead of starting an evaluation, Mr. Lauzon, by asking ourselves, will we do the project? The project has been deemed in the national interest in this case, so we will move forward. So now we have to figure out how we're going to do it in an appropriate way, in a way that respects our environmental standards and the Constitution, but that does so rapidly, and that will incentivize projects to be built more rapidly. The Minister said that on top of this, we could add that for Indigenous consultations, we could reassure them that not everything will be negotiated before the adoption of the Act. You've all said that there's a lot of work to do after the tabling of the bill, after the bill has been accepted. Now, for the good of this committee, could you explain to us how we will respect the processes of collaboration with Indigenous peoples so that these projects can be approved?
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much for the question. I will answer in English to make sure I don't say anything wrong.
Important the Indigenous Advisory Council that will be providing guidance to the Major Projects Office. That terms of reference would be drafted over the summer with the council getting up and running in the fall. That's providing guidance and advice to the Major Projects Office, but the consultation on which projects to add to Schedule 1, and then once they get added, the conditions for each project would actually be done with the Indigenous rights holders who would be or may be impacted by the project. And so I know I got a question yesterday where somebody said the Indigenous Advisory Council would be doing would be the ones consulted on whether to add a project to Schedule 1. And I just want to be clear that it is with the Indigenous rights holders who may be impacted by the project. So it's a two-step consultation with the potential third consultation about if we were to remove a project from the law. Again, the Indigenous rights holders would be involved in that consultation and accommodations.
Merci, Monsieur Lauzon. No, merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lauzon.
Colleagues, before we jump into the second hour of testimony, I want to bring to everyone's attention that the CPAC numbers for today's meeting are off the charts. I've heard that Canadians are tuning in record numbers.
Is that actually
Among
true?
them, according to my wife, are my two children, Anderson and Ellie. So, I want to say hi from
That's
Papa.
child abuse to make them watch.
For reasons unbeknownst to me, they're watching
Evening
us on
political shows, Mr. Chair. I'll be very jealous.
So hi to my two children, and thank you for allowing me to do that. We'll begin our next round of questioning with Dr. Lewis.
Buddy, it's not on CPAC, it's on Parleview. Get it correct, man. CPAC doesn't do committees.
Ministers, thank you for being here today, and thank you to all of the other members on the panel for being here today. Section 21, 22, and 23 operates to allow any project to be exempt from this legislation. Mr. Bassam-Duval suggested that this legislation was similar to the Emergencies Act. I'm seeking some clarity on your answer, Minister LeBlanc, regarding because notwithstanding the validity of a law, Section 21, 22, and 23 of Bill C-5 allows a project to be exempt from the legislation. And we have seen sweeping powers in the notwithstanding clause in Section 33 of the Constitution that allows the suspension of liberties, but there is a provision that protects citizens under Section 1, which is the reasonable limits. Where's the reasonable limits of this legislation? Where's the breaks in this legislation so that federal governments don't become bullies and sweep into municipal and provincial jurisdiction like they did with Bill C-69?
So, Mr. Chair, through you, Dr. Lewis, thank you for the question. I think it's important. The reason the government has put this bill before Parliament is precisely to enable large projects in the national interest to be built. I think that the context and the purpose of the legislation, there's part one, which speaks about free trade within Canada. The part with respect to major projects focuses on enabling. And this is enabling legislation that creates a framework for these projects to be advanced. So, people often refer to the clauses, Dr. Lewis, that you properly raised. Any exercise of authority in that context has to be done with respect to the purpose of the legislation. So if the purpose of the legislation is to enable these large projects to be built, you can imagine a series of statutes that may form part of that evaluation, and then it's exercised by the governor and council, which is not an unusual process.
My question specifically, though, doesn't deal with the enabling aspect of the legislation. We know what the legislation is about, but my question is specifically, what do you, Minister, see as reasonable limits on these sweeping powers that allow the invalidation of laws pursuant to Section 21, 22, and 23 of Bill C-5? Where are the reasonable limits? What do you see as reasonable limits? And why aren't they contained in this bill?
Well, so again, the reasonable, I think it's important, first of all, to put it in context. These decisions will be exercised in consultation with provincial and territorial leaders. The proponents of the projects I'm encouraged by premiers working together to create, for example, energy corridors. The proponents in many cases may be sovereign, provincial, and territorial governments with Indigenous partners. So that is a limitation. That is a limitation in and of itself. We'll be designating projects that have gone through the scrutiny of other orders of government, for example.
But, Minister, yesterday we heard concerns from a number of stakeholders and constitutional experts who confirmed that this bill is vague, has been hastily written, and leaves much uncertainty with respect to projects of national interest. In fact, that determination, it was concluded that that determination would be solely a political decision, which, given these provisions in Section 21 and 22, leaves room for political abuse. And my question, I'm turning back to the question, is where are the breaks in this legislation, and why are there no reasonable limits put in this legislation so that this government can evoke the confidence of the people?
Dr. Lewis, if I may, seeking to understand the roots of your concern, I guess I'd like to understand whether you are concerned that as a result of this legislation, we will build too much. Whether as a result of this legislation, we will get too many major projects built.
Excuse me. I think that is actually a very pejorative way of characterizing my concern. And Canadians are concerned, and I don't want you to minimize Canadians' concern about building too much. That's very facetious and it's unnecessary. We're trying to help, and we had witnesses yesterday that were very concerned about the civil about the liberties that will be suspended in this legislation, and you're making a joke out of it. It's not funny.
No,
it is not funny.
No, truly, I was in no way making a joke. I was being entirely serious. This legislation is being proposed by us, and I believe it is being supported by the Conservatives, because there is a national consensus, which I believe many Conservative MPs agree with, that we have come to a place in Canada where we have such a thicket of processes and rules and regulations at all levels of government that we are unable to build with the alacrity that this moment in time requires. This legislation addresses precisely that realization, and that's why it creates a clear framework to consider and put forward projects of national interest. There's going to be great transparency in terms of which are the projects being put forward. There is a specified list of the areas where the legislation may need to move with more alacrity. And I'm very sympathetic, as I believe my colleagues are, to concerns around protecting due process, protecting the rights of Canadians. Absolutely.
Thank you.
But I'm very confident this legislation will in no way infringe on rights and will do something that Canadians have a right to, which is to build Canada.
Thank you very much, Minister.
I'd like the record to show that my question was not answered.
Thank you, Dr. Lewis.
Thank you.
Next, we'll turn the floor over to Ms. Gazan for 5 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Chair, and thanks to the committee for letting me ask questions. My first question is for you, Minister Alty. Article 19 of UNDRIP provides that states need to seek and obtain free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples before adopting every legislative measure. Has the federal government upheld this obligation with Bill C-5? Yes or no? Just because I have very limited time. I'm an independent now.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question. So this process has been an accelerated process for the legislation.
So
however,
the bill was tabled, that did not happen. Do you believe the advisory circle fulfills the constitutional requirement to consult and accommodate and contain full consent of Indigenous peoples, yes or no?
As mentioned before, the Indigenous Advisory Council is providing guidance to the Major National Projects Office. However, the consultation on projects to add to Schedule 1, as well as if a project's added, the consultation on conditions has to be done with the Indigenous rights holders, which isn't the Indigenous Advisory Council.
So you agree with me that the advisory circle is not an Indigenous rights holder?
Correct.
Okay, well, that's very good. So I have a question. If Quebec says no to a pipeline, I think this would be for you, Minister. If Quebec says no to a pipeline, would you respect that? Yes or no?
The Prime Minister has been clear that he does not see us using this legislation to impose a project over the objection of a province.
Great. Thank you, Minister. Moving to you, Minister Attlee. If Indigenous peoples say no to a pipeline, will that same principle apply? Yes or no?
Yeah, and I think the key thing for this bill is really looking at, the bill is about looking for projects that are urgent.
So just because I have questions follow up. So I just want to be clear. So if Indigenous people say no, I don't want a pipeline,
that's
the same principle would apply, yes or no?
Yes, and so what I was gonna explain for this bill is that we're looking for projects with urgency.
And you've explained that,
as
and that's
well as
already on
advancing.
record. So I just because
I haven't explained that part though.
So what is your
understanding?
understanding?
What I'll do is I'll promise to give you an extra 30 seconds.
Okay, thank you.
Just to make sure that the minister can respond to your question.
Yeah, because I do think it's important that you take a look at the legislation, and it is about evaluating projects that have a high likelihood of successful execution and advancing the interest of Indigenous peoples.
Yes.
And so if projects are being brought forward that don't meet those conditions, we're not going to be able to move with urgency as a federal government.
Sure.
And so we're looking for the high likelihood. We're not looking for Schedule 1 to have 500 projects, because the more projects we have, we want that white glove service.
Can I move on now? So you said, you gave 5 criteria, and I want to read this. It says, in deciding whether to make an order under subsection 1 or 4 in respect of a project, the governor and council may consider any factor, the governor and council, the words are very important, that the governor and council considers relevant, and D, I want to speak specifically to D, advance the interests of Indigenous peoples. Do you think it's appropriate that the governor and council make the decision on behalf of Indigenous people of what's advancing their interests, or do you think Indigenous people should be making those decisions themselves? Because it's very clear in here, and this is a concern that's been brought up by many Indigenous groups.
Yeah, and the key is the consultation would involve the Indigenous rights holders who may be impacted. So the consultation and accommodation would be with the Indigenous rights holders.
So would you agree that this probably needs some amendment?
It's actually section 5.7 that's got, is it 5.7 that has...
So just while we're waiting...
Ms. Kazan, the time is up. I'm going to let the minister look to respond.
Sure.
Just want to make sure she has a moment to look that up and respond to your question.
The 5.7, the consultation, page 10. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Minister, and thank you for joining us today, Ms. Kazan. Next, we will go to Mr. Greaves. Mr. Greaves, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes, sir. 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much to the ministers for joining us today. I'd like to pick up on a similar theme as my colleague related to the 5 factors that are identified in the bill that would guide the decisions around projects in the national interest. Probably for Minister LeBlanc, but I would welcome any of your comments in terms of specifically Clause 5.6e, which specifies as a factor, quote, projects that would contribute to clean growth and to meeting Canada's objectives with respect to climate change. Could you speak, Minister, to how this factor would be considered in the identification of projects of national interest, and whether it means that projects that were low carbon or clean energy projects or projects that help to reduce emissions would be prioritized in the determination of projects under Schedule 1?
So, Mr. Chair, through you to Mr. Greaves, very, very good question. And that particular section of the legislation which you read, E, is deliberately there because in a lot of the conversations that we had with Indigenous, potential Indigenous proponents or provinces and territories, there is a great deal of enthusiasm to put forward for designation and hopefully approval, for example, wind energy projects, hydro electric projects, that the Conservative Premier of Nova Scotia is extremely excited about a massive offshore wind project and the corresponding interprovincial ties that could take that clean green energy to markets in Canada and to our neighbors to the south. That the government of Quebec talked to us about a historic agreement that they came to with the province of Newfoundland and Labrador to further develop the Churchill River in Labrador. It's a project known as Gull Island. Massive, massive green energy project, similar to the Churchill River projects that Hydro-Quebec and the province of Newfoundland and Labrador have operated for decades. So those are just two examples. The Premier's Premier Kinew, for example, the Premier of Manitoba, talked to us about, again, renewable energy projects and Arctic infrastructure that would help defend the sovereignty of the Canadian Arctic while bringing much-needed energy resources, hydroelectric links between his province and Nunavut, for example. So you can see the potential. Your question is a good one. One of the things that's a bit distressing is often in public conversation, this legislation, people go to one particular sector of the economy or one particular type of project, when the premiers themselves, including the territorial premiers, brought a myriad of projects from clean energy to conventional energy projects, of course, to infrastructure to diversify ports, many of them under Chrystia's responsibility. If you think of port projects in Port of Prince Rupert in British Columbia, a massive piece of infrastructure necessary for the effective diversification of the Canadian economy. So you're absolutely right. Those are examples. I would think if the legislation is adopted, Canadians will be extremely reassured by the kind of inspiring projects that proponents bring forward, and including some, and if there's time, Mr. Chair, the Deputy Clerk said she has examples of projects that Indigenous proponents are enthusiastic about submitting for the designation. So you can see the myriad of projects, Mr. Graves, in that regard.
Thank you, Minister, for that answer. Keeping in a similar vein about how this legislation would interact with environmental regulations and with environmental review processes, my colleagues opposite are sometimes a little forgetful about the number of projects that have been built in BC in recent years. We've seen a lot of change, a lot of investment in economic development, while maintaining a commitment towards environmental protection and rigorous environmental review for the projects that have gone ahead in our province in recent years. In that spirit, can you describe a little bit, Minister, how the new major federal project office would interact with the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada and the environmental review process, please?
Mr. Chair, that's a great question. It's technical. I want to make sure the committee benefits from the precise answer. The Deputy Clerk has done more work on this than we have, and perhaps she can offer a very specific answer to Mr. Graves' question.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I think that the most important principle here and what we're trying to achieve is really trying to bring multiple decision points of several sort of government departments in a streamlined way for proponents so we could advance projects. But that still means that there will be interaction with Environment Canada, with fisheries, with transport. But the Major Projects Office would not recreate the good work that is happening in the departments. It would bring together that service to proponents, working with the Indigenous Advisory Committee, working with the Minister and Indigenous peoples across the country on the consultation element. So really it is about, our system can be difficult to navigate. So through the Major Federal Projects Office, when a project is designated of national interest, we will work with all of the components of the system to bring people together in a streamlined way. And that will allow for projects to meet a quicker sort of time frame, and it gives certainty to a proponent at the front end of a project, which can help in a lot of ways. Minister LeBlanc referenced the fact that we've been approached by Indigenous proponents who say, if we are listed under this legislation, we may attract more investment. It may allow our project to proceed. So for us to meet that, there's been a lot of questions around meeting that test of national interest. If a project is supported by an Indigenous community or an Indigenous proponent or with equity stake, if it is supported by a land claims organization and a territorial government, then you can start seeing how it would start hitting the mark of national interest, Arctic sovereignty, trade diversification through potentially Grays Bay Port. So these are examples of how we will assess, and the major federal projects office will look at those project descriptions that come in and will assess the value of that and then make recommendations to the minister, who will then consult his cabinet colleagues, provincial and territorial governments. And I would echo Minister Freeland's comments that there is a lot of unity around the types of projects that come in. And that may mean that provincial and territorial governments may need to work together in proposing projects. But I think the major federal projects office's objective is to streamline the system and give good advice to government on projects of national interest.
Thank you very much, Deputy Minister Fox, and thank you very much, Mr. Greaves. Prochainement, nous avons Mr. Barcelou-Duval. À vous la parole.
Mr. Barcelou-Duval, 6 minutes. Thank you, Chair. I'd like to come back to what the Minister said, saying that I was just talking rubbish, but I would ask him to read the communiqué published by the Acadian Association of New Brunswick that have concerns about this bill and their rights, and go tell them that their preoccupations are absolute rubbish. What is rubbish are the extreme powers that you want to grant yourself through this bill that need to be controlled, that need to be studied, because this bill is not ready to be adopted in its current form. The question I have for you, Minister, I talked about emergency measures. You said it's not a hidden emergency measures act, but there is a sunset clause, and there's also another characteristic. You want to adopt it rapidly, and you give power to the executive that used to be regulated by legislation. Why a sunset clause? Will there be no emergencies in 5 years? We tabled the bill in a context of economic emergency. My colleagues described our concerns with regards to the diversification of the Canadian economy and with national interest projects that could increase Canada's GNP. We are faced with global uncertainty. Economically speaking, there are tariffs from the States. These are all tied together. And that's why we are in an emergency. During the election campaign, Prime Minister Carney was very clear. He said that he would work with our government and provinces so that everyone has to work together. Thank you. It seems that you're giving yourself emergency powers far excessive of what would be reasonable. So I believe this is going to end up in front of the courts. I believe that your bill will be contested in the future. Your bill also allows you to tailor acts that apply or do not apply for a project. So you can negotiate with an entrepreneur what acts will actually be they will actually be subject to. So what are the guarantees that there won't be any corruption under this? I'm not saying that you're corrupted, of course. I'm not saying that you're corrupt. I'm not saying that you're going to cancel the Official Languages Act for big projects. What I'm saying is that this bill allows that to be picked and chosen in the future. Of course, Mr. Barcelou-Duval, I do not agree that this bill opens the door to corruption. I would not want to be associated with such a sentiment. Nevertheless, you are right in so much as we've identified an economic emergency that was shared by premiers of the provinces and territories, and we now offer a new way to move forward for a limited period of time so that we can be more coherent in our way to move forward when projects are deemed to be in the national interest. Designated projects, and the other thing that we don't have to or the other myth that we have to dispel, is that this will be done without transparency. The designated projects will be designated in a transparent way. The conditions attached to the approval process will also be published through order in council. You have no obligation to be transparent. There's almost no countermeasure. The only measure of transparency that you mention is what will be in Schedule 1 and Schedule 2. To me, that's not very transparent. We'll use these powers when Parliament isn't sitting. There is a provision for this transparency, Mr. Barceau-Duval, and in your preamble, in the preamble to your question, you said that normally this is a power that is designated upon the legislative authority. What we are saying in this case is that the Environmental Assessment Act, the Fisheries Act, all these analyses will happen, but will happen in a more coherent way, in an expedited way. And at the end of the day, the Governor and Council will make a decision whether to move forward with a project or not. It's no different than another End of answer inaudible. We've been told that this gives more certainty. It gives more certainty to entrepreneurs for projects under Schedule 1. I'm saying it's full trust and full confidence because projects are being almost pre-approved. We know, the entrepreneurs know that they won't need certain authorization. Usually there are rules and regulations to be studied and followed. What will be the case for public servants who will have to study all these, knowing that projects are, in fact, pre-authorized under this bill? If a project is designated as pre-authorized, do you think public servants will be motivated in their work in analyzing these projects? I believe yes, and perhaps the second highest ranking member of the public service could answer. Projects with Transport Canada, Natural Resources and current departments. Now, it'll just be a front door. They'll work with Transport Canada, that they meet after the front door, and then they'll study the project, and then there'll be an analysis done by experts in market diversification. Then it will move to the Major Projects Office. So what I'm saying is that when analysis is already done before research, then there's no point in the research, is there? Work will be done by scientists with the departments for the conditions that we've identified by the department. Thank you very much, Barceau-Duval.
Next, we will go with Mr. Morin. Mr. Morin, I believe the floor is yours. Correct me if I'm wrong.
No, Ms. Stubbs is to go first.
Cede your time to Ms. Stubbs. So, Ms. Stubbs, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. I appreciate that. I do just want to mention, Minister Freeland, of course, we Conservatives, because we've been calling for fast-tracking clarity and certainty on all of these pieces of legislation and regulations that C-5 allows to be circumvented, we would agree with your comments here today that there is a thicket of legislation and regulations that means big projects can't be built. But that is why we as Conservatives are saying those are your fundamentals to fix those laws instead of doing this workaround. But I just, and further to the point that one of my colleagues was making earlier, Canadians have yet to hear from any of you how it is that you are going to enforce federal jurisdiction on interprovincial pipelines, which are federal jurisdiction, which of course you've failed to do before. But as a person who comes from Treaty 6 and is proud to represent and work with 5 First Nations and 4 Métis settlements in my area, all of whom are involved in both traditional and clean energy and who are the service suppliers and contractors to the oil sands, and also as a descendant of the Broken Head Ojibwe First Nation from Manitoba, I too am concerned about this government's ability to fulfill its duty to consult so far through this legislation. What's concerning, Minister, is you talked about 3 different levels and layers of approval, which is obviously uncertain in itself. And I'm glad to hear that C-5 is promising capacity funding for the meaningful participation of Indigenous communities through this process. I would note that was also promised through C-69. And every time I ask the Indigenous leaders and workers and proponents and private sector owners and operators who, as you know, in Alberta for decades upon decades have been earning their own source revenue for energy development, They say none of that funding ever flowed. So I sure hope that you guys will keep your word this time. But I think that it really is incumbent upon you to clarify exactly how that duty to consult will be deployed by the actual decision makers, since the corridor clear, that's what required is the two-way dynamic to address the to mitigate adverse impacts on affected communities. And I particularly ask you this question in the context of yesterday's AFN National Chief saying C-5 will be an open invitation to court challenges and go all the way to the Supreme Court. So for all of us who want to get to yes in a good way, how will you actually make clear to Canadians that for the first time you will actually fulfill the duty to consult fully and completely, and make that be able to happen given the differences in views among the 600 plus Indigenous communities in Canada?
Thank you, and thank you for the question. So one of the challenges is having a single definition for Indigenous consultation, because, like you mentioned, there's 600 different First Nations, there's Inuit, there's Métis, and so we want to make sure it's meaningful and adequate, and so having that single definition doesn't work. It's also important, it's very fact and situation specific. So for the projects contemplated under this bill, it would depend on the nature of the project, which Section 35 rights holders may be impacted and to what degree, the nature of the Section 35 rights that may be adversely affected, and there's a number of other variables.
Thank you, Minister.
And these ones are affirmed by the Constitution.
Yes.
We've got the Supreme Court. And then this legislation in particular references in the preamble, Section 5.7, Section 7.2, Section 8.3. Those are all required to have to consult with Section 35 rights holders.
Right. And Minister, which has not been done to date, we learned yesterday. But also the bill does set up the cabinet ministers as the decision makers. So will cabinet ministers be at the table on those projects as you go through this specific project by project ad hoc, obviously inherent uncertain consultation? And also, Minister, you yourself mentioned the removal of projects from the national interest list, which you can imagine is deeply concerning, certainly also to Indigenous proponents of, for example, pipelines that got vetoed in the past that they were relying on, or LNG projects that got killed in the past that they were relying on, and had spent years negotiating with big companies in a good way to get benefits for their communities. How can Canadians and Indigenous people who all want to get to yes in a good way on these big projects trust the claims here?
Yeah, thank you. So for that one, that's Section 8.3, so page 12 of the legislation. So if a project is going to be removed, again, there's the requirement, the consultation, and the duty to consult with Indigenous rights holders who may be impacted. So,
but then you can imagine a project proponent getting all the way through and then being told no. And also, then why don't we just start with all the Indigenous-backed projects in front of the regulators right now and fast-track them?
And thank you very much, Minister. Next, we'll go with Ms. Wien. Ms. Wien, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes, please.
Thanks very much. Round two. So I want to ask a little bit about labor mobility, because this is a huge part of why, this is part of the economic growth piece, et cetera. We wanted to make sure that we're addressing the critical labor gaps, and we know that as we get nation-building projects built more quickly, there are going to be cascading benefits in terms of job creation. There was a recent study by the Canadian Federation of Independent Businesses that shows that interprovincial barriers hold back productivity and limit access to qualified workers, especially in skills-dependent sectors. Could you speak to the potential workforce and productivity impact that comes with strengthening labor mobility?
I sure can. And I want to get, before doing that, I just want to get 2 points quickly on the record. One is that when it comes to pipelines, it is important to be very clear that it was a Liberal government and not a Conservative government that got TMX built. That pipeline is up and running, and it is up and running at a time when we really need it, when we need to have a way to get our oil to market that does not just go through the United States. And that pipeline is going to deliver $1.25 billion in revenue directly to the federal government. So let's be clear, that is a reality. let's also be clear that we are on the brink of some huge LNG projects coming online. Kitimat, cedar, wood fiber, including major Indigenous participation. Okay, I just had to say that. And when it comes to Indigenous consultation, the team here, particularly our public servants, have been doing a great job. In the development of this legislation, 66 Indigenous groups were consulted or worked with, and now they are up to 80. So that is real work that has been done and is being done. Okay, labor mobility, which I love. This is tremendously important. It is it's going to be one of the big contributors to those huge productivity gains, to those huge gains in bringing down prices, to the huge overall GDP gains. As I said in my comments, I think to Mr. Albus, the principal impediments to labor mobility are not at a federal level. They are at a provincial level. But I am hugely encouraged by the work the provinces are doing. And this legislation is about the federal government doing our share so that we can say to our provincial colleagues, let's get this done. I want to emphasize two aspects. One is the idea of mutual recognition. It is incredibly powerful. This is how Australia created free trade within Australia. The principle that we should trust each other. If someone has a credential in one province, other provinces should say, you know what? I trust the great people of Ontario, where you and I are MPs, to do a good job in deciding who can be a dental hygienist. And that dental hygienist should be good enough to work in Nova Scotia. That is the core principle. And I want to add one other thing that is connected to labor mobility, and that is foreign credential recognition. If we can get to a space, and we are moving there, where we have mutual recognition of credentials across Canada, that will be very helpful in foreign credential recognition. Both those things will make our economy stronger and also make life better for people. I know all of us have constituents who are frustrated that they're not able to work. It takes too long when you move around Canada.
Thank you, Minister. I'm going to ask one more question. I know we've started to talk a lot about the examples and opportunities around energy corridors and clean growth. My kids are very worried about the transition to our future and talk to me all the time about how we're mitigating against this. Can you tell me a little bit more about how we can use this bill to advance those really important nation-building goals?
Absolutely, and Minister LeBlanc has already detailed some of them. In the 5 conditions, one of them is contribute to clean growth and meeting Canada's objectives with respect to climate change. And we have heard already in the meetings we've been in a lot of enthusiasm around major clean energy projects. Wind energy in the east, this is Premier Houston's passion project, and it will make a huge difference. It could make a huge difference to Canada. I'm going to mention also critical minerals. Hugely important. We need them to build a clean economy, but we need to get the projects built to get those critical minerals and to process them. We haven't really talked about nuclear and about SMRs. That is another set of projects that can be advanced through this legislation.
Thank you very much, Minister, and thank you, Ms. Wien. Next, prochainement, nous avons M. Barcelou-Duval. À vous la parole. 2 minutes et demie, s'il vous plaît.
Mr. Barcelou-Duval for 2.5 minutes. Go ahead. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Yesterday in committee, we heard a constitutional expert, David Robitaille, who insisted very strongly that the definition of in the national interest does not at all match the Supreme Court's definition of in the national interest in its rulings, especially with regard to the carbon tax. When something is designated as being in the national interest, does that mean that it's in the general interest of Canada? But how is it that you've set totally arbitrary criteria which don't match the Supreme Court's criteria and definitions? Answer. Thank you for your question, Mr. Barcelou-Duval. I don't feel that our criteria are arbitrary, given that they are part of a bill before Parliament that will be voted on by parliamentarians both here and at the Senate. Now, there is a case at the Supreme Court on another matter, so there's not a one-to-one equivalency with this legislation before Parliament. In the majority of cases, if not in all cases, this determination will be made based on the result of consultations with provinces and territories. I feel strongly that premiers of provinces and territories, were they to come to us with a project that would affect many provinces and territories, I would approve it because it would be in the interest of many provinces, for instance. Sure, I understand the example you bring up, but what I'm saying is that there is no definition of in the national interest in this bill. The definition you do have is very arbitrary. The only thing we find is at 5.6, where it says the minister can consider, can meaning it's not mandatory, unless you're willing to amend this, and that's one of the amendments the Bloc has tabled today. Well, I'm in no position to speak to the amendments moved here in committee. I leave that to you and your colleagues in this committee. As for the criteria we will use to deem that a project is in the national interest, our criteria are clearly set out in the bill. As my colleague said, you're very lucky because you've had the criteria read to you no fewer than 2 times. Yes, thank you, Minister. I know where to find the criteria.
So you have 5 minutes, please, sir.
Thank you, Chair. And I just want to congratulate the Minister on her appointment to Mr. Alty. Many First Nations often rights get kind of it's hard to understand for First Nations when it comes to Section 35 treaty rights, the umbrellas under that when it comes to how provinces have jurisdictions in certain areas. First Nations traditional inherent rights are mixed into Canadian law. Treaty First Nations have long held that Natural Resource Transfer Act violates treaty rights, particularly Treaties 1 to 11. I'm wondering if the Minister agrees with First Nations rights holders in this regard.
I'd have to look into that further.
Does the Minister agree that resource revenue sharing, when it comes to major projects and natural resource extraction, is a model to agree with that model of resource revenue sharing from the federal government?
I know in the Northwest Territories that's an element, but I'd have to look into it further. As you mentioned, new to the portfolio, so look forward to discussing with you further.
The government has cited $40 million in consultation engagement for First Nations. Typically, we've seen a lot of spending on third-party consultants, $20 billion plus in consultants from the Liberals planning to spend $1,400 per family. For this particular instance, can the Minister guarantee that the $40 million will go directly to rights holders, Indigenous communities, rather than third-party consultants?
Thanks for the question. So it is for Indigenous rights holders. I know in my jurisdiction that, or in my territory, that some rights holders then go to hire consultants, and I wouldn't be in the position to say rights holders have to hire somebody full-time on their team. If they are going to hire a consultant to lead their work, that would be up to the rights holder.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to pass the rest of the time to the member, Jamie Schmel.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to my colleague, Billy Morin, for the time, and congratulations, Minister, on your appointment. Look forward to working with you. Minister, we've had a number of nations here in the capital raising awareness of the fact that they were not consulted on Bill C-5. In particular, the Anishinaabe Nation First Nations, the Grand Council Chief, has said she has not been consulted. We have a number of others that are saying the same thing. First of all, did you have any involvement in the consultation? I believe some are saying they've been given 7 days notice on this. Were you involved in any of the consultation, especially with this nation? And is that the plan going forward, that 7 days notice is adequate consultation?
Thanks for the question. So the project was led by another department, and there was a number of organizations or not only Indigenous rights holders, but also national Indigenous organizations that were engaged on the legislation. Moving forward, the legislation has a two-part, I guess three-part, if a project was to be removed on the consultation. So listing a project in Schedule 1 involves consultation with impacted Indigenous rights holders. The second part, if a project would be
maybe if I could just cut in there, because in your answer to Ms. Stubbs there, you talked about meaningful consultation has to be adequate, but there were no definitions to that. And we're seeing nations here say 7 days. Is that the definition of meaningful and adequate?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, the meaningful and adequate consultation is fact and situation specific. So some of the work that our department has been doing over the past year has been working with Indigenous rights holders as well as national organizations on developing protocol guidelines for the federal government. Outside of that, I do know First Nations, Inuit, Métis also have protocols and consultation guidelines, so we'd be looking to engage with the impacted Indigenous rights holders to make sure that we are...
So what about those that are in favor of projects? We have a number of Indigenous communities that are in favor.
Exactly. So when we're consulting on whether to include a project in Schedule 1, as well as the consultation once a project's added and the conditions, we'd be working with those Indigenous rights holders. And we have Indigenous proponents that want to bring forward projects under this bill.
Okay, so that's good if they want to bring that forward. But how do you still deal with the fact that C-69 is still in place? I know this bill gives extraordinary powers to the government, but at the same time, you still have some pretty powerful impediments to development in place right now.
A very short response, please, Minister.
Yeah, so the legislation for the One Economy is listing a project in Schedule 1 as well as putting the conditions. We engage with Indigenous rights holders, consultation and accommodation. So it would also, if we were removing a project, again, the consultation and accommodation would occur.
Thank you very much, Minister. And concluding our line of questioning for the panel of ministers and officials today is Mr. Kellaway. Mr. Kellaway, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is for Minister LeBlanc, the first question. The Prime Minister has been very clear that this legislation will get us to one project, one assessment. So I'm wondering if you can explain to the committee what that means. And for instance, if we have an agreement for one project, one assessment with, say, the province of Quebec, would they be still required to do, for example, an environmental assessment under their own processes?
Mr. Chair, I think our colleague raises a good question. If we conclude on this, I think it's an instructive moment. One of the things that we've heard about projects, big and small. So this comes back to Mr. Barcelou-Duval's question around smaller projects that may have provincial or municipal approvals. The ability for the government to say that we've signed cooperation agreements with provinces and territories to have one project and one review, it's not about lowering everybody's standards to the lowest common denominator. It's about eliminating duplication and overlap and making because nothing in this legislation affects the jurisdiction of provinces, of course, but it would allow proponents to benefit, again, from a basic principle that makes economic sense. We think it can make environmental sense as well in terms of allowing them to have the certainty that when a project is submitted, there is a coherent, non-duplicative review process. So the Prime Minister's instructions to us have been clear. Within 6 months, he wants us to come to cooperation agreements with all the provinces and territories. And frankly, to build on many of the best practices, provinces and territories have been doing great work in this regard for a long time. If there's a way to ensure that there are comparable federal standards to a province doing the work or vice versa, what an opportunity to assist proponents in arriving at a more coherent and cost-effective process. And what's interesting is this improving of that system will apply to projects big and small. So it's not only about a designated project in the national interest. Done properly, this will assist, we hope, a lot of much smaller projects going through the appropriate scrutiny and review, but in a way that's much more cost-effective and much more effective in terms of time.
Can I offer one concluding thought? I think
2 minutes left.
Okay, I'm going to be super quick.
Thoughts.
So,
Yes, please do.
Dom and I both know what it's like to be on the opposition side of the House. We know the job of the opposition is to oppose, and that's how our democracy works. But in concluding this, I would just like to offer a hope and a suggestion that this is actually legislation all of us can be proud to support. I haven't heard a single person oppose free internal trade in Canada, lifting barriers to labor mobility, lifting barriers to trade in goods and services. We can all get behind that. And on the major projects, I truly believe this is a piece of legislation that brings together everything we as Canadians want. I think we all want to get big projects built. We know we have to do it. I think we all know that we need to respect the rights of Indigenous people and Indigenous rights holders, including their right to build major projects and participate in that prosperity. I think we all recognize and believe we need to respect environmental rights. Je sais qu'on est tous d'accord qu'on doit respecter les champs de compétences.
I know that we must respect provincial jurisdiction.
We can feel good about doing a good thing together for Canada.
Thank you. Just point of order,
Mr.
Chair.
Mr. Kellaway still has 1 minute, 50 seconds.
I would just maybe just really quickly, if we could just have Ms. Gazan add, if the ministers be willing to stay for 1 more minute. I was going to ask for 4 hours more, but just 1 more minute so Ms. Gazan could ask 1 or 2 more questions.
Any objection from committee members? Seeing none, I'll turn it back over to Mr. Kellaway, who still had 52 seconds
Throwing
left.
the NDP a bone there.
Minister Alty, one of the acts of Parliament listed in Schedule 2 of the bill is the Indian Act. Can you explain the reasoning behind including the Indian Act as one of the pieces of legislation that may need parts of it to be suspended for a specific project?
Thank you, and thanks for the question. When moving forward with projects, some communities are subject to archaic provisions under the Indian Act, and so we will engage with First Nations partners on projects, and if we need to suspend some provisions of the Act, like financial clause, leases we've heard about, we will do so in a way that allows for development while respecting cultural practices and environmental standards. But we want to retain this option for where it makes sense to advance a project, but it's after consultation with First Nation communities. So using this legislation on sections of the Indian Act may be beneficial, which is why it's included, but it would only be done in consultation with First Nations. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kellaway, and thank you, Minister. And we'll turn the floor over to Ms. Gazan for one last question of the day. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you to everybody that has come, all the ministers that have come here today. I just wanted to, Minister Alty, you spoke about the FPIC and it being confusion. Because we've signed on to international law, I just want to point to the UN expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous peoples that we've agreed to uphold as FPIC, so we shouldn't be confused at all. But I just wanted to ask, are you aware that the federal government spends between $500 to $1 billion a year annually fighting Indigenous peoples in court, and that ITK, AFN, and NAN have indicated that Bill C-5 is an ungracious invitation to the Supreme Court, meaning that the goal of this bill to be nation-building projects will actually be an economy-killing, job-killing bill, because any projects going forward, it's becoming very clear from constitutional experts are going to end up in court. Are you aware of this? Any one of you can answer the question.
Thank you. So I would emphasize the purpose of this bill is to get approval of good projects, and we know that failing to meaningfully consult with impacted rights holders will not speed up the approvals and will actually lead to the further delays in the courts, which is again why the preamble, Section 5.7, Section 7.2, Section 8.3 all require the government to consult with Section 35 rights holders in both the selection of projects as well as the process of approving them and adding conditions, as well as if it came to the case, the projects would have to be removed.
Thank you very much.
Indicated that they haven't been properly consulted, and this will be in the courts.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kazan, for your question.
Thank you for the time.
Well, it is exactly 5:30, and here at Transport Infrastructure, we pride ourselves on running a tight ship. I'd like to thank
Metaphor,
Minister
you get extra
Alty.
points for that.
Thank you, Minister LeBlanc, Minister Freeland, and of course the officials. Thank you for your time today. We will suspend for 5 minutes to allow the clerk to transition over to the next round of witnesses. The meeting is suspended.
Okay. We are not going to watch... we are not going to watch the rest of this because this, like I said, this is on until 11:59 p.m., which is insane. Yesterday, Parliament, just the actual House, was on until 1 a.m. talking about Bill C-5, and then there was the vote to send it to committee to be able to have amendments and to be reviewed and things like that. So that's the job of this committee, is to call in witnesses, call in ministers. There's witnesses for another 6 hours. We just caught the best of them. Obviously, that's the ones that I wanted, was the ministers. I mean, not to say best, but the most entertaining. I don't think we are going to watch anything else today. That's pretty much the only thing that's going on. 11:59 p.m. Yeah, the ministers are already done. Yeah, the worst of them. So the next witnesses are Canadian Cancer Society, David Suzuki Foundation, Manitoba Métis Federation, Treaty 8 First Nations of Alberta. So there's going to be a bunch of, are you consulting First Nations? Are you consulting, climate change activists? What about the Ducks? This and that. The next thing is Carpenters Regional Council, union members, more Indigenous, more First Nations, and that'll probably be more about jobs and how this plans to create jobs and things like that. After that, from 7:30 till 8:30, this committee's talking about the same thing, still reviewing the bill, but Canadian Credit Union will be there as witnesses. Canadian Meat Council will be there as witnesses. Another First Nations, MacDonald Laurier Institute, and then they go clause by clause on every single part of the bill, and that's with the Privy Council office and the Clean Growth office. So basically it's just going to be a little bit more bureaucratic and a little bit more specific and technical and detailed as this goes on. But yeah, we don't need to watch the rest of this. That's it. So tomorrow, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. 10:30. 10:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time is our first committee. Sorry about that. I said 11. 10:30 is going to be public accounts, and they have witnesses on. So let me see, because they've already convened a chair. They've already gone through rules. Let me see. What are they doing tomorrow? Are we going to watch this? Oh, nice. Karen Hogan's going to be in, Auditor General. We're going to be talking about, are we going to get our money back from GC Strategies after the Conservative motion passed? So tomorrow we'll be live 10:30 a.m. till 12:30, so we're going to be doing that for 2 hours. We're going to have the Auditor General for the whole entire... Auditor General's only there for the first half hour. Okay, but anyway, we're going to watch the public accounts. OGO is on tomorrow. Ethics Committee's on tomorrow. OGO was chaired by Macaulay last time. Ethics Committee was chaired by John Brassard. Both of those committees are usually pretty interesting, so I'd like to see both of those get back to business. There's also the Public Safety Committee. That'll be on around the same time. So there'll be a bunch of committees that we'll be trying to tune into. And then question period tomorrow, 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So I will see you guys tomorrow morning if you're going to be up with me that early. And yeah, let's watch public accounts, and then let's watch OGO, because I think those will be the most interesting of them too. I'd also like to see if John Brassard gets his chair back. So, but that's it for this one. I'm not going to sit here and watch this for another 6 hours. It's absolutely ridiculous. It's already 10:30 where I am. So. Yeah, 10:30 in the morning tomorrow. But yeah, that's it. That's it for this one. Everybody have a good rest of your evening. Have a good evening. Sorry, I was trying to read chat there. I will see you guys tomorrow morning. I am going to go and have a relaxing evening. Cheers, everybody. See you guys tomorrow. Thanks for watching.